And here we are tonight with my live talk with Becky Chernek. And I'm going to tell you something right now. It's Thursday night, and it's a special edition to my live talk with Becky Chernek. And I've got, boy, let me tell you something. I have a great show in store for you guys tonight. We are talking about FTC updates, safeguard ruling updates. But before we get started, for those that are new to this channel, I am Becky Chernek, and I've been providing the very best in finance and insurance training for dealers throughout the USA. And sometimes you guys can go ahead and find me in Canada. And I provide training from the time that customer touches down on that dealership website, BDC, Business Development Center, from sales to desking. And of course, we know how important that desking is. And also to finalizing this transaction in the F&I office with either a designated F&I manager or even that single sales associate. So here now, I have, and we are going, by the way, live on YouTube as well as Facebook, my group F&I Today with Becky Chernek on Facebook. So if you're not there, you need to make sure you join us on F&I Today with Becky Chernek and Facebook. And of course, we're here on LinkedIn live as well. So boy, like I said, I certainly have a great treat in store for you today with Hudson Cook. We have Meg Nicholls. She is the partner of Hudson Cook, as well as Dailey Wilson, and she is the senior associate for Hudson Cook. And we are talking again about these FTC safeguard ruling updates. Welcome, guys. Meg, if you go ahead and start this off and just tell everyone who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Becky, and thanks for having us. I'm Megan Nicholls. I'm glad to be here to talk about the safeguards rule with Dailey Wilson. We are both at Hudson Cook. We specialize in consumer financial services compliance regulatory law. So my practice in particular, I deal with a lot of different companies who have consumer data and want to protect that information. Policies and procedures become very important with that. So we do a lot of work with policies and procedures and helping companies develop compliance management systems overall. So I'm very excited to be here about the safeguards rule. Dailey and I have both gotten a lot of questions over the past few months, year, regarding the updates, and we're excited to help companies delve through those and decide what they need to do. Dailey, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dailey Wilson. I'm a senior associate here at Hudson Cook. My practice is kind of divided in two. I work with the privacy and data security group and working on safeguards issues with them. And then my other side of my practice is small dollar lending and alternative consumer financial products and services. So I help everybody from installment lenders to rent-to-own providers comply with the federal and state laws and regulations that apply to them.
Amen. So good stuff here. So here's what I want to talk about. And I think every dealer, whether they're on right now or whether they listen in later on, they're going to want to know, first and foremost, what is this safeguard ruling all about? So if you wouldn't mind, let's provide a bit of history as to what the safeguard concepts are all about.
Sure, I'll start us off. So safeguards rule has been around for quite a while. It was actually originally effective in 2003. So we've got, almost 20 years of experience here with the safeguards rule. Effective back then and enforced by the FTC as it always has been. And it's always required financial institutions to develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program. So what we're going to see sort of as we go through this chat is that what entails a comprehensive information security program is morphing a little bit. The FTC is giving us some more guidance and is making the rule more prescriptive on what an information security program needs to have within it, but the basics have remained the same. The information security program must consist of administrative, technical, and physical controls. that are designed to protect customer information, and that protection is broad. So it's any use, access, collection, distribution, processes, anything that involves the handling or disposal of customer information. So it impacts a lot of different processes, a lot of different policies, and a lot of different actions that financial institutions take. So the road here has been a long one. The FTC has issued a request to receive comments on where they need to make improvements. And so that's been a road, and it has led to the part that we're at now, which is where the amendments have been finalized by the FTC. And they were supposed to become effective tomorrow, which is why we're doing this awesome special edition show. But the FTC threw us for probably a pleasant early Christmas present gift and extended the compliance requirements until June 9th of next year. So we have a little bit more time, which is actually awesome for us to be talking about this now. So it gives us a little bit more opportunity to get our house in order.
That is so right. I completely forgot. We scheduled this way in advance, thinking that this was going to be the eve of taking in the safeguard ruling. And boy, let me tell you, you're right. You're absolutely correct when you say that Christmas present, we got a reprieve from that. But okay, so when we talk about the safeguard ruling, who must really comply with all that? I know that, when we talk about the financial institution, who is that? What is that all about? And Dailey or Meg, I don't care.
I can start it off with the financial institution is a super broad term. I know when we all hear that term, we think, banks, people who loan money, but it's actually quite a bit broader than that. If you were to delve into the definition, it's very complicated, and you're probably going to go to very many different spots in the laws and regulations to piece it together. But it includes like your typical like mortgage lenders, installment lenders, anyone who extends credit or services credit. So that would include, the F&I behind the paper at a dealership, but it also includes those institutions. But also includes the roundabout way. It requires financial institutions to make sure their service providers have safeguards as well. So anyone who performs a service for a financial institution, which gives them access to customer information, should have adequate safeguards as well. So a dealer who intakes customer applications and things like that on behalf of a financial institution should have adequate safeguards as well. Meg, do you want to have anything to expound on?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is the way that the safeguards rule has been set up is interesting with respect to service providers. And this is nothing new in the safeguards rule, but service providers would do well to go ahead and implement the safeguards rule right now. There isn't a direct correlation under the safeguard. Well, there's a correlation, but there's not a direct requirement under the safeguards rule that service providers implement this. The safeguards. How it's written is that financial institutions must oversee service providers. So at the end of the day, if you are a dealership and you use a service provider, and in the course of providing services, that service provider receives customer information, then it's upon the dealership or the financial institution to ensure that that service provider has met all of the requirements under the safeguards rule, and that service provider is assessed and monitored for compliance. So there is an onus on the financial institution, and Dailey is always really good at reminding folks too that have any sort of hesitation from a service provider perspective that the FTC does have enforcement authority under a UDAP standard. So even though they may not go to a service provider and say, that there's a safeguards violation because there isn't a direct requirement under the safeguards rule related to a service provider. But they can say this was an unfair, it was a deceptive, or it was abusive act or practice. And so if you are a service provider, don't think you don't have any responsibility here, because I think at the end of the day, if there is some sort of a breach or a security lax of some sort that leads to a breach of customer information, then it is possible that the FTC can look at the service provider as well as the financial institution that was in charge of overseeing that service provider. So it's a very important topic for the entire ecosystem in automobile dealers, that all customer information is protected at each stage of the cycle.
So I hear you. I get that, I think. So I'm going to ask you, okay, so could you define for us guys in the car business that may not understand some of these terms, what is a service provider? Be very clear. Is that someone like myself who's going into a dealership to do training?
So the
What is
technical
that?
definition is any person or entity that receives, maintains, processes, or is permitted to access customer information while providing services directly to a financial institution. So if you are a service provider that doesn't receive any sort of customer data information, so we're breaking it down, like cleaning service at a dealership. I mean, they provide a service to the dealership, but they're not going to get any customer information, right? They're just mopping the floors and taking the trash out. But to the extent some sort of ancillary products provider maybe, or your cloud server host, you're storing your customer information there, they're receiving it, they should have safeguards in place to protect that information there. So the key is whether you receive information or otherwise could get the customer information, and if you do, you can become considered a service provider under the rule.
So let me ask you a question. There are times, okay, for a service provider, and I don't want to get into the weeds with this too much, but I want to clear the air here. So when I go into a dealership and I do some due diligence, I'm looking through their deals, I'm tracking to see how they're desking a deal or how they're doing a menu presentation. So I'm going to have access to some of this information. So does that also tie me in to making sure that I'm also a protected source through this service provider definition? Am I saying that correctly?
I would think yes, and yeah, that's so taking a broad and lower risk assessment here. It's always better to well, I guess I shouldn't speak in terms of absolute, but it's usually better when you do a risk assessment, which we'll get to in a little bit. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But when you're looking at all of the folks that have access to your customer information, you're going to look at your employees, you're going to look at your contractors, and you're going to look at anyone who has access to that information. So otherwise permitted to access customer information in the definition of service provider is very broad. So that's probably the broadest of the caveats or the words that are used to describe a service provider. Obviously, if you're sending customer information to someone who's providing a service, or they receive customer information directly from you, or they need to process that customer information in order to provide the services to the dealership, they would be a service provider. That's involving a little bit more, right? It's a deliberate send or receive, and it's a deliberate process related to that customer information. But under the safeguards rule, I think the FTC, going back to sort of the primary purposes of the safeguards rule, to protect customer information. So when we talk about privacy and we talk about data security, we want to make sure that that customer information is held private and it's protected using controls that are secure. So anyone who has access to that customer information should be using reasonable controls. And it's up to the financial institution to ensure that any of their service providers have these reasonable controls in place. So when you're looking at who is a service provider, what you want to do is take a step back and really look at the ecosystem that you have set up for processing any type of application or any type of information that you receive from a customer, and really who sees that. And if it is someone who comes in and they help with a risk assessment, they are your qualified individual who needs to see this information as part of their daily job or what have you. Those would be falling under the safeguards rule. And we'll talk about qualified individuals. I know I'm introducing more and more words as we're talking here, Becky, instead of actually answering your question. But yes, if you go into a dealership and as part of your services, you need to look at a couple of deal jackets to follow that process through and to help that dealership understand where they've got gaps or where they can improve training. That would all fall within the safeguards rule. Now, one of the cool things about the safeguards rule is there's this reasonableness that's throughout. Okay, so and we'll see that as we go through as well with some of the more technical requirements. The FTC has provided for lack of a better word, akin to exceptions, maybe not exception as what we truly think about as an exception where I don't have to comply. That's not the case. But they do provide some alternatives that you can look at or that your qualified individual can look at and implement to the extent that certain requirements under the safeguards rule are not feasible for that particular financial institution. So when you're looking at your service providers, you're doing your assessment of your service providers, one of the things that you'll want to look at is what is the risk that's posed by that service provider. So if you're physically going in to a dealership and you're physically looking at a deal jacket, and maybe it stays on that particular a computer or whatever within the dealership, or maybe it's a physical file, that poses maybe a different risk depending on if it's a physical file or if it's a computer, and you don't have any access to that information when you go back to your own location as a service provider. You're going to look a little bit different on that risk profile, right? So
Sure.
The financial institution's job at that point is to say, okay, I understand my service provider is going to come in, and let's take maybe a simple example where they've got a printed deal jacket and you're going to look through 10 printed deal jackets and you're going to help them really delve into their process and figure out where they can improve things. What they're going to want to do is say, okay, what's the risk of Becky coming in and physically looking at a printed deal jacket, and where could there possibly be an indication that that information's taken and breached somewhere. And that's where they really need to get to the point of looking at each individual service provider, what's the risk, and how do I develop what are called controls to mitigate that risk of any type of breach of information.
Well, I think that certainly clears that up, doesn't it? So it really does depend whether or not I can take that information and take it back with me wherever I go, or how does it relate to like electronically, and how that can be a possible threat by me taking that information online to wherever I may have access. And so those are different risk levels that a dealer would have to go ahead and evaluate to make sure that there's that higher risk. And that would be with service providers such as myself. And I think that's really important because I wonder how many dealers are really assessing their service providers, from consulting to others who may even have access into maybe they're a third party provider of sorts, and
And, you know, we
having
could tie
access.
back into, yeah, we could tie back into Dailey's example earlier about the cleaning crew that comes in too. If you've got printed customer information sitting on a financial, an F&I desk, right? You've got your finance manager, and they're in there cleaning the finance manager's office, but there's customer information riddled all over. That could pose a breach, and so it becomes incumbent upon the financial institution to really implement controls to ensure that that information is not accessible to the people who should not have access to it. And that's actually a requirement under the safeguards rule. So when you're thinking about your cleaning crew, traditionally, they would not be a service provider, right? They wouldn't fit that definition. But you do still have to have controls in place to ensure that anyone else does not have access to information that shouldn't have access to that information, which means you need to keep customer information locked up. You need to shred it appropriately and dispose of it properly, which is another requirement. So, you know, we can play this game, I think, down many different avenues, but it really does center back onto the risk assessment. Who could potentially, where could I see a leak of this information, if you will?
So, Dailey, is there anything else you would like to add to that before
I think that tackles it.
You guys are great. Okay, so talk to me, if you will, or us. What are the requirements with regard to this? And let me just say this: authentication, multi-point authentication. I don't know, but I have the toughest time with this authentication with. So like when we talk about driver's license, when we're talking about encryptions and things like that, what does that all entail? Multi-point, you know, what does that mean? What do dealers have to do to protect from that information as it pertains to this multi-point authentication? And I'm like, why can't I say that word? But anyway, it is a tough word for me to say, and I can repeat it a million times, but still here we are. How does that work?
Multi-factor authentication, I think, is what you're referring to.
Yes,
and that is one of the specific safeguards that are now required under the rule. So previously, the rule was super broad and set forth a few key requirements, such as you must have an information security program, but it didn't tell you any specifics about that. Now the FTC has gone back, and many of the changes they've made deal with specific elements they expect you to incorporate into your security program. So it sort of sets a baseline, like these are the minimum standards. You may need more, protective standards, but this is what we consider baseline. And one of those is multi-factor authentication, which requires companies to implement an authentication method that includes 2 of 3 factors in order to access any system that contains customer information. So the 3 possible factors are a knowledge factor, which we typically, your password, we're all used to using that. The second kind is a possession factor. That could be a token, and that gives you a code that you type into the database, in order to access it. The last type is inherent, which is like your biometric characteristics. So you could be really fancy and have like a retina scanner or like a fingerprint scanner, and that would be the third type. So you need 2 of those 3 in order to access a system containing customer information. And I think what's key here is that goes for systems accessed by customers if they contain customer information. So not only systems accessed by you or your employees. So if you have an online portal that contains account information about a customer that they log into, that also should be accessible by multi-factor authentication. Technically, the rule says that you could approve, the qualified individual could approve an alternative control rather than multi-factor authentication, as long as it's just as protective. However, Meg and I have looked at this issue, and we're not quite sure that there's anything that really is as good as multi-factor, and that would really satisfy that requirement. So while they say that other options are available, they don't really exist. So,
Okay.
Unfortunately.
So you have this authentication multi-point that a dealer, auto dealers, let's talk through auto dealers, are required. So how does that fit into that sales process? How is that fitting in? I mean, walk me through that, us through that. Because I want to know, when does that fit in? Do we, that we adhere to this multi-point authentication to make sure that we're in compliance? When does that happen? How does that happen? Anyone?
So this is a loaded question, Becky.
I'm so sorry. I'm trying to figure this out.
Yes, you and a lot of other folks right now. So
okay.
one sort of disclaimer, let me put out there now, is that Dailey and I are not information security gurus. So
Okay.
we'll put that out. We understand the safeguards rule. We've talked to a lot of information security folks, but we ourselves are not trained as information security people. So that's point number one.
Okay.
Point number two, going back to the risk assessment. So this is where every financial institution gets the opportunity to ask the very question that you're asking, Becky, and that is, when do I need to implement MFA? And so the answer to that question is going to depend on the processes in particular to that financial institution. When you're looking at the sales process, so if you have a salesperson who is logging into a system, and that is one, I guess, little asterisk that we can put on MFA that may help in some respects, is MFA is really a technical requirement on a system. So if you are still dealing with a paper application, there's not really a good way to do multi-factor authentication at the paper application stage. So that's maybe a place to start. So as soon as it goes from a paper application and now it's into a system and someone is accessing that system that is connected to or directly linked to customer information, that's where the multi-factor authentication comes into play, is right there at that moment. Now, can you ask the question of, okay, well, how often do I have to authenticate? Absolutely. Can you ask the question of how many times or how many factors do I need to use? Well, at least two, but depending on the system, depending on the risk tolerance for the financial institution, depending on the processes in particular to that financial institution, MFA and when it's in place, how often it needs to be authenticated, how often the authorized user needs to be authenticated. All of those are questions that an information security person would really be the best person to answer. But I think from a regulatory point of view, one of the things that we'll advise clients and sort of as look at as part of the process is, once a person is authenticated using multi-factor, is there at any point a part of the process where that authentication doesn't mean a whole lot? So, if there's a certain amount of time that goes by, if there's a certain transfer of service from a salesperson maybe to a finance manager, the finance manager may need to authenticate him or herself as well. So there's, different avenues to sort of think about. But essentially, anytime that customer information is accessed, the financial institution needs to know who that person is. And I think if you can't answer in the affirmative that you know who is accessing that customer information, you ought to authenticate again. Dailey, do you disagree, or would you add anything to that?
No, I think that is totally accurate, especially when you take into account other requirements, which is to have log who's accessing the customer information. So certainly if you switch users, you need to have them re-authenticate, and that way you're creating a trail of who's gotten in there and who's gotten the information. But yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I can see like from the sales perspective to the desking, from desking into F&I or BDC from the transfer from our business development center. We authenticated that multi-point authentication. Anyway, we did that step.
You can just say MFA. That's the easiest way to say it.
I'm like, gosh, that word, I don't know what's up with that. But, go from BDC to sales, from sales to desking, to be able to authenticate, and assure that again, the transfer of information is really what you're talking about, right? To assure that information is correct. And depending upon the departments that are receiving it, I think that's what you're saying.
So a little bit different.
Accessing it.
Yeah. There you go.
Or accessing it.
We're concerned about who's accessing the information. I mean, of course, the transfer is something that is contemplated by the rule and something we want to protect and make sure it's secure in transit. But the point of multi-factor is making sure that the people who are accessing it are supposed to be accessing it.
So the individuals that are accessing it are supposed to be the ones that are accessing it. It's not necessarily
just like we all use
transfer.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And it's the same thing. Like, I'm sure your bank has it. My bank has it. Every time you log into your bank account, you have to, use your password, and then you get like a text being like, here's your code. Let's type it in to make sure that I'm the one, supposed to be accessing my bank account. So it's the same concept that will apply there. So they're going to make sure that the person who is, logging in and getting into the management system is supposed to be there.
So it's not so much transfer of information yet at the same
that requirement.
Really, what the requirement is that the individual accessing is supposed to be the person that's accessing it.
That they're the authorized, yes.
They're authorized.
That applies to making sure. Yeah.
That's really good. That's really good.
There are other requirements that would apply to the transfer. Like there's others.
Let's talk through that. What's the requirements for the transfer?
So, that the information be encrypted.
Ooh, yeah, that's right.
Encrypt customer information both in transit, so when you're sending it outside, and at rest. So when the information is just sitting in storage, essentially, when it's not being actively used by your institution, it should also be encrypted, which basically means that you're going to scramble the information so that you have to have there's an access key that will scramble it, all in the background. And I'm giving this very high level. This is encryption is way more complicated than this, but at a high level, basically you're scrambling it, and then the person has to have an access key or key to unscramble it. When I was learning about encryption, I went back and it's thinking about it in terms of spies, a long time ago. They would write a message in code, and then the message would get sent to the person who was supposed to receive it, on the other side, and they would know the code and then could decrypt the message. So that is, we still use encryption today. It's just way more technological, but the concept has been around for centuries.
So it's almost kind of reminds me your website could be encrypted, but you want to make sure that the information is going to the right individual. That was the whole idea for it to be encrypted, to protect that individual.
Right. So that's what that if it's encrypted and it gets into, theoretically, and there's different levels of encryption, but
receiving money,
making sure that if somebody received a message they weren't supposed to receive and it's encrypted, there's some methods of encryption that would prevent that person from being able to see it. And a lot of this encryption happens in the background, and it's way more advanced than I could explain. So I know that when I send out an email, it's encrypted, and then when the person gets it, it's gotten unencrypted somehow in the background. But there are methods of encryption that require you to know like a password to open it, and that would prevent somebody from accessing it if they got emailed mistakenly, for example.
And you want to know why. I mean, this stuff can get really kind of confusing. And this is the reason why we're doing this event, because episode, we want to talk through some of this that says, let's try to make this not as confusing. Dealers are like, what am I supposed to be doing here? Why should I be doing this? But I think
So
that
I think in particular at rest requirement is, I mean, as a common example, and you can look at some FTC actions, is hackers are trying to get into your information. So they're going to try to get into your database and get that kind of customer information so they can take it and do nefarious things. So by encrypting it, you're protecting it from somebody who gets into your database, because they won't be able to read it if they don't have the key. So they may get in, but it looks like, gibberish to them.
Yeah.
So you're protecting, so that's the one way you're being able to protect your customers' information. And that's why you want to encrypt it at rest. So it's not just sitting there in plain English waiting for somebody to read it. Meg, do you have anything to add to these?
No, I think that's definitely, can we take a step back, Becky? I think it might be helpful if we talk about what a qualified individual is, since we've been throwing that term around quite a bit.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so historically, the safeguards rule required financial institutions to have an employee or a group of employees that were in charge of information security and sort of knew what they were doing, right? Well, now we have morphed into this qualified individual terminology, and a qualified individual is specifically designated by the financial institution to know what they're doing with respect to information security. The qualified individual is actually the one who has to look at all of the controls. They have to determine if the controls are effective. They have to determine what needs to be remediated, which is a term we use a lot in compliance. And so the qualified individual is a very, very, very important person in all of these processes and in developing a good, solid information security program.
Okay.
So, we'll probably talk about this in a little bit, but sort of where to get started, right? Who's your qualified individual? Because I think identifying that person and making sure that that person has the answer to a lot of the technical questions. Again, we're not the technical folks here, but if you've got a qualified individual who can help decipher all of these technical requirements, Becky, to your point, they are confusing. They're confusing to us as well. And so having that technical person that can help you really, that can explain those technical pieces and how they affect your information security program in a variety of different ways is very important, and something that if you haven't started looking at your information security program, probably one of the things that you ought to start thinking about. I guess one of the good things about the safeguards rule, even though you have to have a qualified individual, that qualified individual could be a service provider. So if you've got a qualified individual that's not, or you don't have a qualified individual in-house, you can have a consultant on the outside that's your named qualified individual. But guess what the service provider still has to do? Or I'm sorry, the financial institution. They still have to oversee that service provider. So you still have responsibility, you still have skin in the game as a financial institution, even if you don't have your qualified individual sitting in your house.
So, okay, let me just confirm. The financial institution is also considered could be also considered the auto dealership. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I think a lot of times they don't see themselves as a financial institution. So I want to make sure that dealers understand that, yes, you qualify as a financial institution because of what? Let's restate that. Because you extend credit to for personal reasons, etc. Yes. So if you could maybe share the reasons as to why a car dealer is considered a financial institution. Dailey?
Dailey, you want to take that one?
I can start. You may have to hop in, Meg. I mean, certainly in the case of a buy here, pay here dealer, they're providing the financing. So they're extending the credit. They certainly
more than four
are.
installment, right? And more than four
Yeah.
installment payments. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And yes.
That would make them credit under TILA, Truth in Lending Act.
Yes.
But whether credit under other statutes and things depends on the definition there. But yeah, that would make them credit under the Truth in Lending Act. But offering, so they're certainly offering credit, which is, if you offer credit, if you extend credit, you
for
loan
personal
money
purposes,
you buy something on credit over time, you are a financial institution under the rule. In the case of, your dealership, like a franchise dealership, who works, on the franchise dealership paper, even you're still extending the credit at the front end. I mean, in the back end, of course, the captive finance company is going to be purchasing that paper, and then they're taking the transaction from there. But on the front end, the dealer is still the creditor.
They're still the creditor until the finance company purchases.
Yeah.
Or
when you're looking at that retail
on.
installment sales contract, it says, whatever, ABC Ford Motor Credit Company or Ford dealership, whatever. That's the person who's listed as the seller and the one who's the creditor at the front end. So, anytime a dealership sells a car and the person finances the car through them, they're a financial institution under the rule.
It really gets a bit complicated for these guys because they're like, I can tell you how many years, for how long I have talked about the fact that these rules apply to car dealers because in the government eyes, they also see you as a financial institution. So until the lender buys that deal from you, you're on the hook for it, period. And under the same rules and obligation as a financial institution, you are it. And I can tell you when I first found that out through Tom Hudson back 20 years ago, I don't know, maybe longer than that. And he goes, Becky, I'm telling you right now, they are obligated just as much as a financial institution. I'm like, what? So all my training, a lot of it in the very beginning is really understanding why we're up against what we're up against. Why are, some of these rules and regulations apply to car dealers. And I just try to take it to the basics, right? And try to make sense out of it that way. And so a lot of times you have car dealers that go, well, that's up to the bank. That's up to the lender. It's not on me. Well, it is on you. So this is why it's so important.
Think about it from the perspective of the customer. The customer goes to your dealership and they're in their mind entering a transaction with you. Now, of course, behind the scenes, it gets sold and whatnot down the line. But when the customer is there,
you still have to protect their credit. You still have to protect who they are and what they're all about. Which brings me to a really good question. I think it's a great question. You're all like, oh. What's the difference between red flag ruling and the safeguard ruling? So I know a lot of dealers are like, I get the safeguard ruling, Becky. I'm not sure. Red flag. What is that? What's the difference?
So red flags is really, at the very high level, it's the prevention of identity theft. So anything that would be an indicator that someone is not who they say that they are is called a red flag. And add enough red flags up and you have a fraudster, not a consumer legitimately sitting in front of you, but someone pretending to be somebody else. So red flags is really the identification of a potential identity theft threat. So you look at that red flags rule, that's also under FTC jurisdiction, and a dealership, financial institution in general, is required to go through their processes and identify where there could be a potential for information to be obtained from a fraudster or someone pretending to be a consumer and gaining other information back, or a product or service, or what have you. So it's the identification that there's been some sort of a transaction or potential transaction with a fraudster or with someone who's not authorized to act as that consumer or on behalf of that consumer. You look at that from a safeguards rule, and it's like, okay, yeah, we're talking about two separate things, right? We've got safeguards, which is security, which is we've got these strict multi-factor authentication requirements, and yeah, we've got to encrypt data when we send it out. Okay, yeah, that has nothing to do with red flags. Well, when you look at your red flags program should have something about the identification of indicators that someone may be using information that they're not supposed to use. Okay, a consumer, someone pretending to be a consumer. When you look at your safeguards program, you should have controls in place that prevents the access to customer information by someone who's not authorized to access it. So when you're looking at this from a holistic compliance system, it's good to look at the two of those together. And the reason for that is because you may have red flags in your red flags program that are already identified that your qualified individual can look at on the risk assessment for your safeguards program and make sure that you've got the appropriate controls in place to mitigate against anyone not having authorization who could potentially access customer information. So your red flags rule might help you conduct your risk assessment, and you need to make sure on both sides that you've got controls in place. Number one, at the front end, right, to identify identity theft red flags, and on the second, on the back end, to make sure that all the customer information you have is protected from unauthorized access.
Okay, so in your travels, do you feel as if or think that dealers are pretty much wrap their head around between the difference between red flag and safeguard ruling?
Well, I think it really does depend on, does that, I guess as a starting point, does that dealership or dealer recognize that they are a financial institution who have these obligations? Number one, that's probably the starting point there. And no, it is tricky. And that's why we have jobs as attorneys, I think, too, is because that's part of what we can help with, is determining, through conversation with the dealer, okay, so what forms of factors do you see that could indicate that you've got someone sitting in your dealership that's pretending to be somebody that they're not? Is it a driver's license? Is it questions that they can't answer that are identification questions? What does that look like, and how do you mitigate against identity theft? And then on the back side, okay, you've got customer information now. What do you do to protect that customer information from being accessed by someone who isn't authorized to access it? And no, they aren't easy, and they aren't necessarily apparent to everyone who's looking at these topics, especially if you're new to answering these questions or asking these questions. I think the answers can be fairly confusing.
Well, I do. I think that they when I first met with Michael Benoit and Tom Hudson, I'm dating myself here, people, now. I'll never forget red flags when we first came out, and I'm in a meeting for lunch, Michael Benoit and Tom Hudson in Washington, D.C. And I was like, okay, Beck, we've got the book. It's the red flag book. You get into these dealerships and we're going to train the dealers on red flag. And I'm like, okay. And that was a big splash, right? Red flag, and the importance of making sure that we are protecting that customer as it pertained to becoming a victim, right? Of fraud, a fraud victim. And it's important that we help to mitigate that response and that we're responsible for that. And I think a lot of times, and today we might have dealers may have processes such as um, mm, their credit reporting agencies, and they utilize some of that for the red flag to determine if there is a potential threat. And by, I don't know, maybe there's a indication that that person may not be who they say that they are, and there's the red flag that shows up, and meanwhile we have the out of wallet questions. Is that enough? Are we doing our due diligence by hopefully stopping in our tracks to stop and say, let's take a breather here. We've got an alert here going on. Is this person who they say that they are? And the reason we want to stop in our tracks is because we're obligated, because if in the event we end up selling a vehicle to a victim or a potential fraud, it's impacting somebody else's credit. Yes. So who's responsible for all that in the long run? The dealer, as it pertains to these FTC ruling, right? So it would be important for dealers to have a better understanding of what that red flag means, what my responsibilities include, and then part of all that, if I don't have established a safeguard ruling process in place, or even a red flag ruling process in place, then it's all on me. It's all the dealer. If in the event there is a potential threat victim that's been compromised because a dealer didn't have a certain process policy put in place. Would that be fair? Am I saying that correctly? Am I correct in this assumption? You guys are the attorney, not Becky. Although I wanted to be one. I should have been one. Always wanted to be one, but anyway. Is that
No,
about right?
yeah, no, you're right, Becky, that dealers have this obligation on the identity theft prevention side and on the safeguard side. It's a twofold process. They don't link in the regulations. They don't cross-reference each other. So it's one of those when you're in the position that you're in, Becky, where you're talking to dealers and you see the ins and outs of what's going on at the dealership. I think that's where it becomes readily apparent to you that, wait, we've got this that's talking about identity theft and fraud, and then we also have this safeguards where we need to implement controls to make sure that we don't have a data breach, that our information's not accessed by a fraudster. And so what is the end goal in all of this? It's to protect consumers' information and to help consumers not become victims of fraud and identity theft. So you're right, Becky. They've got a very similar purpose. They've got responsibilities on both sides, and it's important for dealers to really take a look at their programs. You asked a really good question, and that is, am I doing enough? And that is not a question that should be taken lightly, and it's not a question that necessarily has a one-size-fits-all answer, which I think you're probably hearing me say more than everyone wants to hear someone say. But it really does depend on the dealer. It depends on the risk posed by that dealer. And one of the keys, and one thing that makes a good compliance system work, is having a baseline process. So you've got your red flags program, you've got your safeguards program, you've got your qualified individual that's reviewing your risk. Once all that is said and done, take a step back in a quarter. Look at, have we had anything identified to us that someone was a victim of identity theft and somehow we still wrote that paper? That's something to take a look at, right? And a lot of times in the compliance and regulatory world, we'll call that a root cause analysis. So what happened with that particular deal that we missed, or that we didn't catch that we were dealing with a fraudster, or what happened in our safeguards environment, that there was a control that we could have put in place that we didn't. So those are all really important questions to ask, and something that is asked in sort of a postmortem or after the fact, but it does really, really affect how effective that compliance management system or policy or control or however broadly you want to think about it. But looking at that assessment on the backside is also very helpful in determining if what you're doing at the front end is effective or needs some work.
I think it's really important for dealers just to really, like you said, take the time to assess what's happening. And I think a lot of times if they would look at that and realize, well, we had a breach. Okay. Why? What was the breakdown? What didn't we do in our process that we probably should have done that would have prevented that from happening? Is really what we're saying, Dailey?
Right. Yeah. And in fact, actually, the safeguards rule, one of the new requirements is to have what they call a written incident response plan, which is basically a written plan for how you're going to deal with a breach. And it has to include certain elements in your plan. And one of those elements is the requirement, your plan must require you to evaluate any instances of breach you experience, look at what you need to do differently, and then to change your program if necessary. So the rule affirmatively now requires you to take that sort of step in the event of a breach or some kind of other security events, even if information is not even officially accessed, but somebody gets in and you can see that you would need to evaluate that there too.
So, I know that frankly, over the past, 20 years, that, let's call it in the past, I don't know, since I met Michael Benoit and Tom Hudson, I don't even know how many years that was, but there comes a time that sooner or later we got to get this right. We have to realize our duties and responsibilities when it becomes understanding that we got to protect the customer's information, right? We need to understand what our rules of engagement is. And so I know it's tough for some of these guys, but do you think, and I'm throwing this out here, it's a tough one, I get it. But do you think by the time June 23 comes around, 2023 comes around, you think the dealers are ready for this still?